At just before dawn, police vans stopped outside multiple addresses across northwest England. Doors were forced. Armed officers moved room to room. Within minutes, phones were seized, vehicles were searched, and one encrypted account, used daily to organize serious crime, went silent. That account was linked to Sean Monaghan. Here's the question that matters. How did a man who believed his communications were secure end up leaving a complete written record of his own criminal operation? In 2020, UK authorities gained access to EncroChat, a private messaging system used almost exclusively by organised crime groups. For months, police were no longer guessing. They were reading instructions as they were sent. They were watching decisions being made in real time. Sean Monaghan thought his crew was protected by technology. What investigators uncovered instead was a structured operation involving cocaine supply, firearm movement, trusted lieutenants, and detailed planning. This story is not built on rumors or assumptions. It is built on court transcripts, police evidence, and messages written by the people who believed no one else would ever see them. By the end of this video, you will understand how this network operated, how it was exposed, and why cases like this change how organized crime works in the UK. And if you want to keep understanding how these investigations actually unfold, before headlines simplify them. Subscribing means you won't miss the next case where the evidence speaks for itself. By the late 2010s, organized drug crime in northwest England had become established rather than emerging. Cocaine supply routes linking Liverpool, Merseyside, and Greater Manchester had existed for years and were used repeatedly by the same networks. These routes were reliable, familiar, and profitable. After 2016, cocaine demand across the UK increased steadily. The change was not limited to quantity. The way groups operated also shifted. Firearms were no longer treated as separate or occasional. They were moved, discussed, and stored alongside drugs as part of routine operations. This development increased the level of risk for everyone involved, including the communities where these groups operated. Police intelligence from this period shows a clear rise in organized groups capable of accessing weapons and moving large quantities of drugs. These were not loosely connected individuals. They were structured operations with defined responsibilities and internal discipline. Sean Monaghan operated within this environment. He was born in the late 1980s and raised in northwest England. He had family connections in the area and lived locally. He did not arrive suddenly or operate as an outsider. His presence was familiar to those around him. Before the main investigation began, Monaghan was already known to police. His name appeared in intelligence records, not in relation to street dealing or minor offences, but in connection with others involved in organised supply. This placed him away from the front line of crime and closer to its management. He did not personally handle day-to-day sales. He arranged contacts, passed instructions, and resolved problems when they arose. Evidence later showed that others acted on his direction. Suppliers dealt with him because he could move drugs efficiently. Those beneath him followed orders because he controlled access to money and protection. This role allowed Monaghan to remain visible without appearing exposed. He did not hide completely, nor did he draw attention through excess. His confidence came from experience within a system that had operated in the same region for years. What requires explanation is not how Monaghan entered this world, but why he believed he could continue operating in it while levels of violence and police attention were already increasing around him. That belief would shape every decision that followed. Sean Monaghan's rise did not happen suddenly, and it did not rely on spectacle. It developed through contact, access, and repetition. His early criminal activity placed him in regular contact with wholesale suppliers rather than end sellers. This mattered. It meant his role was never about moving small amounts or competing for territory at street level. Instead, he learned how supply chains worked, who controlled them, and where pressure could be applied when problems arose. Over time, Monaghan moved away from handling deals personally. Responsibility shifted outward. Others collected, delivered, and stored drugs. He coordinated. Instructions were passed through intermediaries. Decisions were made without his presence being required. This change was deliberate. Monaghan was not impulsive. Evidence later showed that he avoided unnecessary exposure and delegated risk downward. Those beneath him absorbed the danger of transport, confrontation, and arrest. He remained removed from those moments while still controlling outcomes. Loyalty within the group was built through money, access, and consequence. People who followed instructions were paid. People who caused problems were cut off. Reputation mattered, and it was reinforced through consistency rather than threats alone. Between 2018 and 2019, the scale of the operation increased. Cocaine was no longer handled in small quantities. Multi-kilo supply became part of regular activity. This level of volume required planning, trusted contacts, and confidence that the system would hold. During this period, firearms entered conversations as a form of leverage rather than defense. They were discussed as tools to maintain control, settle disputes, and reinforce authority. Their presence changed the balance of power within the group and raised the stakes for everyone involved. This was not disorder or improvisation. It was organized, controlled, and intentional. The human cost of this structure was carried by others. Couriers took the risks of movement and exposure. Associates lived under constant pressure. Families connected to those involved often remained unaware of how deeply crime had entered their daily lives. Monaghan's position insulated him from immediate danger, but it depended entirely on the continued obedience of those below him and the stability of the system he believed he controlled. That belief would soon be tested. During 2019 and 2020, the organization led by Sean Monaghan operated at a scale typical of a wholesale organized crime group. It was not a casual enterprise. It involved defined roles and sustained activity across multiple criminal markets, particularly in cocaine, heroin, and amphetamine supply, and the possession and movement of firearms. At the center of this network was Monaghan himself. He directed the acquisition and distribution of large quantities of controlled drugs. Between March and June 2020, the group supplied at least 50 kilograms of cocaine, 20 kilograms of heroin, and 200 kilograms of amphetamine across the northeast of England and beyond. The group did not work as a single unit. It was structured. Simon Lancaster, described in court records as one of Monaghan's trusted lieutenants, was involved in some of the most critical operational tasks. Messages later analyzed by investigators showed Lancaster handling receipt, bulk storage, and onward supply of multi-kilo quantities of all major drugs moved by the network. Lancaster also collected, counted, and stored very large amounts of cash that flowed through the operation. At times, he was responsible for the preparation of drugs, often referred to in the industry as quality checking and bulk processing, before distribution. Bryn Bowden played a key role in the storage and movement of amphetamine. Evidence reviewed at sentencing confirmed Bowden had access to a shipping container used to hold significant amounts of amphetamine and ammunition. Over time, he also moved large amounts of cash on behalf of the network, facilitating further purchases of cocaine and other drugs. James David Ramshaw was responsible for the collection of cash and the supply of cocaine, particularly in areas such as Northumberland. At the time of the investigation, police surveillance observed him during cash exchanges and found substantial sums, at least £100,000, moving through his possession. Stephen Graham, Monaghan's brother-in-law, acted as an intermediary in dealings involving firearms. He agreed that prohibited weapons would be held by co-conspirators on behalf of the organization and helped arrange practical matters related to those weapons. James White, who did not have an encrypted device of his own, was involved in storing Class A drugs at the direction of others. His participation stemmed from a drug debt relationship. He stored substance consignments and returned them when asked. Across the group, contact was maintained primarily through encrypted EncroChat devices during 2019 and 2020. These devices were believed by their users to provide secure communication. Within the encrypted messages exchanged between Monaghan and his associates could be found detailed records of the quantities of drugs moved, the prices paid and requested, specific discussions about firearms and ammunition, including where they were held and who was responsible for them, and repeated warnings from members about rival groups and potential police action. As the months passed, volumes moved by the network increased. At the same time, so did exposure. The focus on scale. Moving drugs and cash routinely brought rising confidence. Members spoke frequently about expanding operations, handling larger consignments, and finding new ways to store firearms. This growing sense of capability quietly translated into carelessness in communications. The system that allowed Monaghan and his team to issue orders and manage logistics also created an extensive digital record of their activities. Every instruction, request, and update was written, timestamped, and stored on devices that were later accessed by law enforcement. The EncroChat evidence used in this case appears again in dozens of later prosecutions, involving different crews, different weapons, and different outcomes. If you don't subscribe, you'll miss those cases when they surface here. By early 2020, the balance had already shifted, although those on the outside had no way of knowing it. That year, the National Crime Agency gained access to EncroChat data as part of a coordinated international law enforcement operation. Thousands of encrypted devices being used across the UK were compromised at once. Messages were no longer protected by the system users trusted. They were being captured, preserved, and analyzed as evidence. For investigators, this was not speculation or inference. It was direct communication, written by the people involved, in their own words. Monaghan's network was identified quickly. His EncroChat handle appeared repeatedly in conversations involving large drug quantities, logistics, and instruction. Analysts were able to map relationships between users, identify command structures, and distinguish organizers from those carrying out orders. The key breakthroughs came from the detail. Messages linked Monaghan directly to the coordination of cocaine supply, including quantities, timing, and distribution points. Other messages showed discussions about firearms, where weapons were held, who was responsible for them, and how they were to be managed within the group. There were also clear examples of Monaghan delegating tasks that involved intimidation and enforcement, assigning responsibility while keeping physical distance from the outcome. This evidence removed uncertainty. It established role, authority, and intent. As data continued to be reviewed, moments of concern began to appear in the messages. Monaghan questioned unusual activity. He discussed rumors of arrests elsewhere. At times, warnings were passed within the group about being careful, limiting exposure, or reducing communication. But the concern came too late. Crew members were told to adjust behavior without understanding that past messages had already been secured. No instruction could undo what had already been written. The system they relied on did not allow deletion, revision, or silence to erase history. Monaghan believed the primary danger came from rival groups, disputes over territory, or betrayal within the criminal world. That belief shaped how he responded to pressure. What he did not grasp was simpler and more final. The real threat was not chasing him. It was already logged, time-stamped, and stored. The takedown did not end with arrests made on British soil. When coordinated operations were carried out in the UK, several members of the network were detained quickly. Addresses were entered without warning. Encrypted devices, phones, and documents were seized before communication could spread. For those caught in this phase, the operation ended in a matter of hours. Sean Monaghan was not among them. As arrests began to dismantle parts of the network, Monaghan left the United Kingdom. His departure was deliberate and unannounced. By that point, communication within the group had already begun to fail. Messages slowed. Instructions stopped. Those waiting for direction received nothing. Without central control, the operation collapsed. Planned collections did not take place. Supply arrangements were abandoned. Associates attempted to protect themselves by cutting contact and distancing from locations they believed were compromised. The silence that followed replaced the constant flow of orders that had sustained the group. On December 4, 2023, an international red notice was issued for his arrest. The response was immediate. According to Turkey's Interior Minister, Ali Yerlikaya, Monaghan was located and apprehended within one day. On December 5, 2023, he was arrested at a hotel in the Fatih district of Istanbul. The detention followed direct coordination between Turkish authorities and international partners. Monaghan was taken into custody and later deported to the United Kingdom, where he was formally arrested to face the charges connected to the operation he had once directed. The disruption extended beyond him. Simon Lancaster, described in court as Monaghan's trusted lieutenant and a central operational figure, was located abroad. He was detained in the United Arab Emirates and later held in Oman while extradition proceedings were considered. His absence left another gap in what remained of the organization. In July 2025, before the formal extradition process concluded, Lancaster chose to return to the UK voluntarily. By then, the structure that had supported the operation no longer existed. Supply lines had ended. Communication had stopped. What remained was evidence already secured across multiple jurisdictions. Public reporting began to reflect the full scope of what had been uncovered. The scale of the drug supply was made clear, and the presence of firearms within the same operation drew particular attention. For communities affected by organized crime, this confirmed that the group had operated with both distribution networks and the means to enforce control. The case was heard at Liverpool Crown Court, where the prosecution set out its evidence methodically, relying on EncroChat transcripts, device data, and financial records. The focus was not on character testimony or inference, but on communication that had been preserved exactly as it was sent. Over the course of the trial, prosecutors presented messages exchanged between members of the group, placing them into chronological order and tying them to specific movements of drugs, cash, and firearms. Each message was attributed to a user account, supported by device attribution and corroborated by other evidence. When messages were read aloud, they were read as written, without interpretation. The prosecution described Sean Monaghan as the organizer at the center of the operation. They pointed to repeated instructions issued by him, decisions about quantities and timing, and his role in resolving operational problems. The Crown argued that Monaghan exercised control rather than participation, directing others while insulating himself from direct exposure. In addressing the court, the prosecution emphasized the scale of the operation and the presence of firearms as part of the same criminal activity. They argued that weapons were not incidental, but were used to maintain authority and reduce resistance within the network. The judge accepted that assessment. In sentencing remarks, the court described Monaghan's role as one of leadership and responsibility. The judge noted that the EncroChat evidence showed sustained involvement at a high level, with planning, coordination, and decision-making carried out over an extended period. The inclusion of firearms was treated as a serious aggravating factor because of the risk posed to the public. Monaghan was sentenced to 27 years imprisonment. The court then turned to the other defendants, sentencing each according to their role and level of involvement. James Ramshaw, aged 41, of Hambleton Court in Ashington, was sentenced to 9 years and 4 months. The court found that he played a significant role in the movement of drugs and cash, acting on instructions from above while managing activity at a local level. Bryn Bowden, aged 28, of West Farm Avenue in Long Benton, received a sentence of 7 years. The judge accepted that Bowden was involved in storage and movement of drugs and ammunition, contributing materially to the operation without directing it. Stephen Graham, aged 45, of Alston Gardens in Throckley, was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment. His involvement in matters relating to firearms was treated as a serious factor in determining sentence. James White, aged 45, of Orchard Drive in Hwelton Grange, was sentenced to 6 years. The court accepted that his role was more limited, but still essential to the storage and handling of drugs within the network. One defendant was not sentenced at the conclusion of the case. Simon Lancaster, of No Fixed Abode, had returned to the UK voluntarily after being detained abroad. His sentencing was adjourned to a future date while the court considered whether time he spent in custody in Oman should count as time already served. Until that issue is resolved, his sentence remains outstanding. As the judge concluded, the pattern across the case was clear. What had once been private communication became the foundation of public accountability. Messages that once carried authority were repurposed as evidence. With Monaghan and his key associates behind bars, a power vacuum emerged in the Northwest. Smaller crews and independent operators scrambled to fill gaps, but none could immediately replicate the scale or organization of the Monaghan network. Supply chains that had once been reliable were disrupted almost overnight, leaving uncertainty and instability in areas long accustomed to regular drug movement. For law enforcement, the case offered lessons. Investigative methods, surveillance, and digital intelligence were refined. Authorities began to anticipate how encrypted communication and cross-border movement could be used, and how quickly it could be tracked once systems were compromised. Response times and coordination improved, but the underlying question remained: criminal networks adapt as fast as the law does. Beyond drugs, this case was about control, communication, and the belief in invisibility. Monaghan's confidence in his encrypted devices had allowed him to direct operations across counties, shield himself from immediate risk, and keep associates in line. That same confidence ultimately became the record that dismantled everything. The lingering question for communities and law enforcement alike is simple, yet unsettling: how many others operate with the same belief? Secure, untouchable, unseen, and are still waiting to be exposed. Stories like this don't end when the trial concludes or the cameras stop. Share this if you think people need to understand how quickly power collapses when it rests on control and secrecy.